My name is Pablo de Jesus. I'm the Executive Director of Unitarian Universalists for Social Justice, one of your hosts this evening. I use he, him, and L pronouns. I'm a bald guy with a goatee, wearing a shirt and a tie. I'm set against a virtual background that displays our UUSJ logo and the Capitol Dome. I'm a resident of Washington, D.C. on Anacostan ancestral lands. I join you tonight from my home in the middle of what we call the Crazy Eights, better known as bedtime for those of you with young children. I thank my wife for holding down that part of life at the moment this evening. And I ask for your joyful tolerance and indulgence if my kid jumps on my lap or makes a cameo appearance during our time together this evening. I want to acknowledge that we have Paulette of UUSJ helping to manage the technology tonight, which is always great. And we will do our best to keep things moving and keep things smooth, operating nicely for you. But we are human, so if we stumble or have foibles, again, treat us with love. With Zoom interactions dominating our lives these past years, I encourage everyone to please take care of your own household and bodily needs, but still be mindful of your microphone and video. Know that we're recording. Please be respectful of each other, our speaker, your hosts. Be gentle with each other, because we're pleased to have Reverend Dr. David speak to us tonight. As Unitarian Universalists, we're constantly seeking to engage on our assumptions and challenge our own skepticism about what is possible. And so we will hear from Reverend David this evening about what is possible in a tough political climate when good causes are under threat and as we're entering a period of divided government. And he's one of the best. He has deep experience, serious policy chops, and advocacy acumen. So to do that well, we're going to continue to let the audience in and gather, and I'm holding some space, helping us get situated, doing the general welcome and housekeeping. And then we're going to open a sacred space and light our chalice. We thank Reverend Kristen, a UUSJ board member, for doing that. Afterwards, Charlotte, our UUSJ board chair, will introduce Reverend David. Then he will share his thoughts with us. Afterwards, Charlotte and I will manage some Q&A. You're invited to put questions into the chat as we go along. Perhaps put a Q in front of your question so that I can easily flag that it's intended for the speaker. Afterwards, after the Q&A, we're going to extinguish our chalice and our event will reach its soft close. I will, however, linger for warm goodbyes and the odd question in the style of an after-service coffee hour, because so many of you have told me that you really like the way that we do these things and how we let things sort of come to a natural conclusion rather than forced conclusion. So now, please join us, not only in joy and happiness, but also excitement, because next week we're going to have another great speaker, Vanessa Williamson of the Brookings Institution, is going to give us a talk. It's titled Racial Oligarchy and Fiscal Conservatism, Ending the Anti-Tax Era. We will drop that RSVP in the chat. And I want you guys to know that Vanessa happens to be a Unitarian Universalist, so that's nice. So please consider joining us next week also. And if you like this type of informative programming, please support UUSJ with your donations. Your donations are what make our great programming and federal engagement possible. You are helping to shape and build a UU movement for federal advocacy. You are cultivating an unremitting presence in DC for our values and our principles, and you are sharpening our denominational presence for justice. For UUSJ, it's been an action-packed 2022, full of strategically meaningful and impactful direct federal issue advocacy, combined with action alerts and letter campaigns backed by education and witness. We've engaged on free and fair elections and voting rights. We took co-leadership of the Racial Justice Working Group with the American Friends Service Committee among the Washington Interfaith staff community. We deployed a joint campaign with the UU Service Committee to restore asylum and end Title 42. We celebrated World Water Day and put pressure for the passage of the Water Resources Development Act. We advocated on Defund Hate. We advocated on Green Climate Fund. We advocated on the Electoral Count Act. We continued organizing with the Poor People's Campaign and the Fusion Movement. We mounted our own voter mobilization project here in this region, collaborating with UU The Vote, the Read Voting Rights Project, and the state action networks of both Maryland and Virginia. We also defended the IRA from abhorrent anti-immigrant amendments. And we mobilized with Green Faith in advance of COP27. And throughout the year, we've had many, many briefings on issues, plus special talks with folks like Texas State Representative Donna Howard, Andrea Miller, and Lee Brumpman, trying to deepen our understanding of our democracy and its circumstance. And we can do so much more in 2023 and beyond. We can push further for voting rights and inclusive democracy. We can defend food stamps and make progress on hunger. We can continue to champion sustainable agriculture, fossil-free economy, child tax credits. We can defend immigrants and pursue a real pathway towards citizenship. And we will not bend the knee to apathy or hate. We can widen our circle of concern, going after root causes and harms. We can partner with impacted and frontline communities and say no to sacrifice zones. We can include the vulnerable in our discernment. And we can do our part to confront nativism in legislation, which many of our interfaith friends are more specifically naming as white Christian nationalism with greater frequency. What is possible for us is grounded in our determination and dream for a better democracy and our willingness to live our faith. We will cultivate the next generation of advocates and activists for love. We will connect UUs from shore to shore, from mountaintop to valley low, from urban to rural, to make good trouble. We will build out an organization, a movement for federal engagement to match our sacred dreaming for what is possible. Now, I know the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, but it requires many hammer strikes with the power of love behind it to overcome indifference. So I invite you to join UUSJ in this adventure for justice. I ask you to donate and volunteer to make it happen. And again, we welcome you. We're happy to have you. We're excited to host Reverend Dr. David Beckmann, President Emeritus of Bread for the World and the coordinator for the Circle of Protection. Please add your particulars in the chat. Be mindful of the mic. Know that this event is being recorded, and always respect each other, our speakers and our hosts. And with that, I give you Reverend Kristen Schmidt. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. It's so good to be with you this evening and so wonderful to have Reverend David here. I can't wait to hear all of the wisdom that he has to share with us. So let's light our flaming chalice. We light this chalice, symbol of our free faith, with gratitude for the many who went before us, who left legacies to remember, to follow, to emulate. As we kindle this light, may the fire of commitment, the spirit of truth, love, and justice that was in them be kindled in us as well. God, whose other name is love, as the present year begins to die, help us remember that no season lasts forever, that the days of the greedy and powerful are numbered, that there is a force at work in our world and in us that lifts up the oppressed and fills the hungry with good things. In these days of growing shadow, help us turn away from the glare of life's distractions so we might accept the gifts of the darkness and follow where the stars are calling us. As the festival of lights draws closer, rekindle within us the flame of resistance over and against the powers that lead to assimilation and death, with love of freedom and culture and gratitude for miracles, big and small. In this season of watching and waiting, free us from despair's well-worn ruts. Make through the deserts of our hearts and world a way for hope and peace, joy and love to be born anew. Come, let us listen, let us learn, let us recommit to what is possible together. Amen.
Thank you, Reverend Kristen. Positively poetic. I'm feeling in the season already. Hello, everybody. I'm Charlotte Jones-Carroll. I chair the board of UUSJ. It's a transformed board. Just a year and a half ago, we moved from being a regional board to a national, almost international board. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker tonight, and partly because we've known each other for over 40 years. David and I met in the process of preparing a World Bank project in Ecuador, the Guayaquil Urban Development Project, which was focused on providing and improving the living conditions and social services for the low-income parts of that coastal city. A number of years later, the idea that we development professionals at the bank should center the voices of impacted people rather than parachute in with our supposedly expert ideas emerged. And that simple concept, which for me was only a vague intuition, David turned into a plan of action. He helped start a participatory development learning group, which over a few years helped embed in the bank policies a change in the way bank professionals, World Bank professionals, approach their country counterparts. I would love to take the time to tell you all sorts of ways that made a big difference, but I want to go on and hear David. David and I were also part of a small multi-faith group within the World Bank called the Friday Morning Breakfast Group that met weekly. We shared ideas about more spiritual and humanistic matters. This was kind of like a, David can correct me, but semi-subversive initiative in the context of an institution that was normally led by engineers and hard economists. That Friday morning group might have been the first in the bank to discuss things like corruption and environment. This is why I've been a longtime admirer of David's skills at prioritizing vulnerable humans and listening to their voices. I was actually enthusiastic when he decided to accept the Bread for the World presidency in 1991, even though it meant losing a like-minded colleague. Now, let me summarize here what many of you have already probably read, but Reverend David Dr. Beckmann's accomplishments. He is a Lutheran pastor as well as an economist. He's a family man, married with 2 sons and 4 grandchildren. He worked as a World Bank economist and, as I mentioned above, a sort of internal advocate for issues of hunger and poverty from 1976 to 1991. At that point, he left to become president of Bread for the World. And if you don't know Bread for the World, it's a key multi-denominational Christian nonprofit advocating to end hunger, both in the US and around the world. I think you served almost for 30 years there, David. So Bread for the World's mission is very similar to UUSJ's in the sense that we want to educate and equip people to advocate from the grassroots for policy change and for programs. In the case of Bread for the World, it's to end hunger. In the case of UUSJ, well, Pablo has listed some of our priorities: immigration, democracy, environment, and reducing poverty. After leaving Bread for the World, David continued his advocacy work. Of course, once you're an advocate, you can't give up. And I have to say, I had to learn to be an advocate because while working at USAID and the World Bank, I was hatched as an American. The Hatch Act kept me from advocating in the way I had to learn once I retired. But you continue to serve, as Pablo said, a coordinator and co-chair of Circle of Protection, which is an advocacy coalition of church bodies and agencies active in shaping and supporting President Biden's Build Back Better legislation. But here is one of the reasons we have him with us tonight. He's also begun to teach others about effective strategies for linking faith to political advocacy, which is again what UUSJ is trying to do. In his case, he continues consistency with reducing poverty and hunger. He does that at Virginia Theological Seminary, but he also does it in opportunities like this webinar. So I have to thank you. David, I will mention you were awarded the World Food Prize for your contributions to ending hunger, but I would give you any number of prizes for all that you've taught me over the years. So let me stop here and just let all the rest of you experience some of David's wisdom on work, which really is at the heart of what UUSJ also does. Take it away, David.
Well, thank you very much. I think that that may be the most gracious introduction I've ever received. Charlotte, really, we've been friends for a long time. And I really appreciate, Charlotte, your leadership of UUSJ. It's great to work. We keep working together in different ways. I also want to thank everybody who's on this call. You're all leaders, contributors, activists in pushing for social justice. You wouldn't be on the call if you weren't. So it's a real privilege for me to be able to meet with you tonight and share my thoughts, and then I look forward to the questions and answers, or I don't know, maybe objections and rebuttals. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. I want to make 3 points. First, that advocacy in Washington is an effective way to push for social justice. Doesn't mean always in Washington. I love, like Charlotte noted in the chat, that you come from all over the country. That's the way you move Washington, because the people gathered here do represent people from all over the country. The second thing I want to talk about is how important it is to engage the people who are directly affected by injustices in the advocacy, to hear their voices, to work with them. And then the third thought is I just like to talk a little bit about the election that we've just been through and how that may change the environment for advocacy over the coming year. I'm just delighted that UUSJ are putting new emphasis on advocacy at the federal level. My long experience has made me absolutely sure that changing US government policy is crucial, absolutely crucial to real progress on many social justice issues. And I'm also sure that it is possible for all of us working together to leverage really substantial changes in the world by speaking to our members of Congress and, in some case, the president and administration officials. Over and over again, I've seen small groups and individuals change the position of their member of Congress, even unlikely heroes. You know, because we do live in a democracy, and members of Congress want to please their constituents. I think we've all seen that the faith community has been able to, over and over again, has taken on really big challenges, and not always got everything. We haven't always gotten everything we want, but even on these big issues, we've been able to help achieve major changes that are consistent with our values and our faith. I've really focused my whole career on hunger and poverty in our country and around the world. And so I'd like to start with my favorite graphic. So I'll share my screen. A seminarian here named Casey Jones helped me figure out how to do this. Okay. All right, how are we doing? Good. What this, you can see why I like this, because these are numbers on poverty over recent decades. They're on the international numbers are from World Bank absolute poverty data. And I think that long-term series of data may be the most robust way of measuring economic misery over the decades. And what it shows is just extraordinary. If you forget everything else that I say, remember the drop-off, this cliff. In 1990, roughly 35% of the people in the world lived in absolute poverty. And by 2019, it was down to about 8% living in absolute poverty. I see this as obviously it's just a huge liberation. And I see it as an exodus in our time, an experience of our loving God. It's certainly, no matter what you think about God, it is spiritually important that over these last decades, we have been through such a liberation. Now, there's still a lot of terrible problems in the world. Right now, there's a group of countries where there's a concentration of the most severe hunger that we've seen for forever. People near famine. So, this macro picture doesn't show all the problems, but the macro picture is important. And then what I also find really striking is that that the pandemic has clearly been a big reversal, especially 2020. It probably jumped up to 10% of the populations of the world. 2021, the bank thinks it's gone back to 9% of the people in the world. That's still a hell of a lot of people. Still, I think this overall picture of progress against global poverty is tremendous reason for hope. And U.S. faith communities have had a role in this liberation. Really, if you go back to, say, the 1990s, foreign aid was really, really unpopular. No member of Congress wanted to defend it in daylight. If they were going to support it, they'd meet at night. It was just really unpopular. Bill Clinton got elected because he said George H.W. Bush was too internationalist, and so was Democrats and Republicans together, who were tough on international aid. But the faith communities have always been in favor of effective development and humanitarian assistance. Not all U.S. What the U.S. calls foreign aid, because there's a lot of security aid that serves U.S. purposes, but humanitarian and development aid, effective humanitarian development aid, we've always supported it. And then really starting in about 1999, right at the end of the Clinton administration, that was when the faith community won international debt relief for the poorest countries in Africa and other parts of the world, especially well-managed developing countries. And then from then on, what we've seen is a steady increase in U.S. Poverty-focused development assistance. It's quadrupled in size between 1990 and 2019. And also the quality of foreign assistance has improved substantially. And we've had a lot of help from Bono and Bill Gates and Bush, George W. Bush, surprisingly, and also Barack Obama. And in the Trump administration, by that time, there were enough Republicans in Congress that we were able to maintain the level of poverty-focused development assistance through the Trump years. And then Biden has been an important advocate for it. So we've had a lot of help, but the faith community has been important over and over and over again over these decades, always an important leader in increasing and improving aid. And that hasn't been, there have been many reasons why we've seen this dramatic reduction in poverty. I think the most important one is that poor people around the world now know a lot about how to get out of poverty. They know about schools, they know about rural roads. They know what ought to happen. And like people everywhere, they are willing to do everything to get their kids a better life. So it's that drive among people in the world that I think is the main motor, maybe that and the purposes of Almighty God that have driven this great liberation. But there is no question that U.S. leadership on foreign aid, on poverty-focused development assistance, has contributed to this huge change for the better in the world. I was awarded the World Food Prize in recognition of the fact that the U.S. faith community had played a substantial role in reducing world hunger. Now, look at on the left side, you get the domestic poverty numbers. These are based on the Census Bureau's best measure of poverty. The first bar is 1967 because we made more progress. The most progress we've ever made against poverty was during the War on Poverty and the first couple of years of the Nixon administration. It was then that the country on a bipartisan basis just had the sense that we ought to do something about poverty in America. I think partly because of the race riots of the Black Power movement, all that. I think both parties knew we needed to do something. And so this goes back to 67 because so much of the progress was made then. But that period established the social welfare programs, and they've been under attack ever since. We're always on the defensive with them. But in fact, we've been able to maintain that level of funding pretty much and also improve the quality of those programs over the years. So it's important for us in the US. It gets discouraging, as we go through things, it can be really discouraging. And I think it's important to put it in perspective and remember that measured by poverty and some other indicators that we've made progress in this country. The part of this that I really want to focus on is what's happened during the pandemic, because it started during right at the very beginning of COVID. You remember 7 million people lost their jobs. There was there were people cars lined up at food banks, long lines at food banks all across the country. And we had every reason to expect that we would see a substantial and sustained surge in hunger and poverty. That's what happened after the financial crisis of 2008. So that's what I expected. But remarkably, even in the last year of the Trump administration, Republicans and Democrats worked together on major legislation, massive legislation, to keep the pandemic from collapsing our economy. And the Democrats negotiated big increases in unemployment assistance as part of that package. So we managed to stave off that the increase in hunger and poverty that would have been expected. And then in 2021, this number is just unbelievable. Child poverty and hunger among families with children dropped to their lowest levels ever in the history of the United States. In the middle of the pandemic. You know, we know that the pandemic has caused a lot of suffering. It still is causing suffering and dislocation, but by these important metrics of food security and poverty, 2021 was a banner year. Now, the ironic, horrible thing is that in December, all the Republicans and Senator Manchin voted against continuing key elements of the American Rescue Plan, which had done a lot of this good, notably the child tax credit. The expansion of the child tax credit drove much of the progress against poverty and hunger that we saw in 2021. And all that stopped at the end of the year. So child poverty jumped back up about 25%. All is not lost, I should say, because my guess is that poverty and hunger are roughly at the levels of 2019 and 2020. But it kills me that we know that the child tax credit expansion did tremendous good for millions of kids. We know from studies of what happened that it did not depress employment. The adults in those households kept working. They used the money well for food and rent and those sorts of things. So there is just, I just can't understand how we can let that experience go by and not re-expand the child tax credit, at least for the poorest families. Okay. As the coordinator of the Circle of Protection, I've been, as Charlotte said, I've been working on these big money bills that affect poor people and trying to help a wide array of church bodies and agencies like the National Council of Churches, the National Association of Evangelicals, the National Network of African American Clergy, work together on those bills. And I think we've had, the faith community has, I think it's very clear that we've had a very substantial impact. Going back to that last year of Trump in focus, we managed to focus attention on the poverty relevant provisions and then push and with people from different faith communities working together, often people from all across the country speaking to their own members of Congress. That's the most important thing. We've clearly had an impact and should take some satisfaction in the fact that poverty and hunger did not increase significantly during the pandemic in the United States, and that in 2021, millions of children had a remarkably good year. The second point I want to talk about is the importance of hearing from the people who are directly affected by social justice. UUSJ has really made that a major feature of your work. You bring it into the faith community in a very strong way, into your collaborative relationships with other groups. And it is really very important. I think it's possible, more possible than it used to be, there's a lot of new energy among low-income people in speaking for themselves. So it's not like I think some things have changed. Digital media, social media in fact, made people more informed, sometimes misinformed, but informed and engaged. We see that by the record participation in elections, also decades of faith-based organizing in about 200 communities across the country has trained a lot of low-income leaders to speak for themselves and push for change. So, and just there's nothing like it. If you're in a meeting with a member of Congress and somebody from the district is there who, or a couple people from the district are there who have lived poverty or living poverty, it changes the tone of the conversation. It's serious, and there are people who have real knowledge and passion. They can't be stopped. I also think it's a smart idea that you're partnering so strongly with the Poor People's Campaign. I was teaching at Union Seminary in New York last fall and got to know Liz Theoharis and was just so one of the co-conveners of the campaign. And I'm just really impressed by how savvy they are. The campaign, as you know, thinks in terms of poor and near poor people. It makes sense because people who are close to the poverty line often fall under the poverty line. You know, they have a car repair problem and then they're in poverty. You know, they can't feed their kids, or, you know, then they maybe climb out and then they're back down. So I think it's a smart strategy to focus on 100 million people who are poor or near poor and help them to be strong in advocacy, savvy on the issues, networked, and they have a long-term vision. They don't expect to win, you know, on all the issues right away, but they think over the decades ahead that if poor and near poor people get organized, they will push for fusion change, for environmental sustainability, more peaceful policies, more just policies. So I think it's a smart strategy, very much grounded in people who are suffering from poverty and related issues. And so I applaud you for that. I also it's important. I think I learned from the gay rights movement. My son is gay. One of my sons is gay, and he came out when he graduated from high school. I think in that first couple months, he convinced several hundred people who had never really thought about the issue before to support gay rights because they knew Andrew. You know, so it was people at our church, people for his friends, our family. Everybody was for Andrew, and but I think, you know, that happening. What we need on poverty issues too, we need more poor people who are not ashamed to say, you know, my family is really struggling, or we've needed food stamps, and people in the past were ashamed of that. But as people come out and speak for themselves on the poverty issue, I think that'll change our politics. Finally, I want to talk briefly about the election. The political environment for social justice is still tough, but not as tough as it was before these elections. It very much seems like the Reverend Senator Warnock in Georgia won today, and that'll contribute to an easier environment in the Senate. It won't all depend on Manchin anymore. The most important result of the election, of course, is that Democrats maintained their majority in the Senate. They kept the Republicans to something like a 5-vote majority in the House. And they also outdid the Republicans in state elections. It's really quite an accomplishment. And I think it's also very important that the extreme right just lost. Almost all the candidates that President Trump was really pushing were defeated. And I think all of the election deniers among candidates for governor and attorney general were defeated. I think that change within the Republican Party may do us as much good as the Democrats winning. Anyway, I think for the theists among us, the elections are cause to thank God. You know, the close balance between Republicans and Democrats, I think, means that the next couple of years could be a very very important time, fruitful time for advocacy, because every one of the moderate Republicans has the kind of leverage that Senator Manchin had last year. You know, if you can get 5 or 10 Republicans to vote against the fiscal cliff, or vote against or vote for some creative poverty or social justice provisions, you know, you win. So I think, but the advocacy groups are going to play. They have more room to play, more place where they can maybe influential than if one party or the other dominate. I want to ask you to do something this month, and that is to contact your 2 senators about expanding the child tax credit, especially for the poorest families. In my judgment, we're not going to get everything we want. If we're to pass, there has to be bipartisan legislation with that can command the votes of 10 or 12 Republicans. And so there needs to be negotiation, but even in that, there are some Republicans who are really interested in the child tax credit. Republicans, in a way, invented the child tax credit years ago and have done good things on it. So there's possibility for a negotiation that would expand the child tax credit, especially for the poorest families. And that's what I'm asking for. Pablo has put an action alert in on the UUSJ website. And so I'd urge you to take a look at that and then just send a note or make a call to your 2 senators. They're all skilled at that. In conclusion, I want to talk about the 2024 election and just the importance of elections generally. You know, I worked in a bipartisan way on advocacy for all those years, 28 years at Bread for the World. But since I retired from that, I've been more involved in election work, and I've learned how important it is. I have also learned that only 20% of Americans give any money to political candidates or parties. I just think, you know, it leaves the field open for outsized influence by a relatively small number of mega donors, individuals and corporations. So I really encourage you to give time and money generously to USSJ. That's the point. That's the main point that I want to make. But also, I encourage you to give time and money to candidates and to parties and to voter mobilization. You know, so that we by 2024 that we've got a different kind of Congress in those chairs, and our advocacy can go forward more ambitiously. Thanks a lot. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, David. Very stimulating. I hark back to our World Bank days when you showed us the metrics. I think it is really important to see those metrics because as some people have commented, it doesn't feel like such a change. So thanks for those 3 topics, how important federal level advocacy is to move Washington, and you've seen that it works. You've seen that it makes a difference. We really have experienced the last few years the ability, thanks really in part to the pandemic and moving to Zoom, but also our move outward to incorporate constituents, not writing letters anymore, but actually getting on our Zooms with congressional offices and speaking directly to the staff that we are talking to. And yes, your music to our ears about the importance of engaging people who are directly impacted by policies and programs. So we're going to keep trying to do that and develop more partnerships. And it's exciting to hear, you know, people thinking there's hope in the election outcome that we've just had, and maybe there's hope for 2024 too. So let me, thanks for that pitch for your USJ donations. I know probably everybody on this call has already donated through the purchase of a ticket, although it was sliding scale. If any of you feel the urge to get more generous as the year ends. We'd welcome more donations. You can just go on our website, uusj.org, and click the donate button if you feel like it. One of the things I want to be specific about, in case you wonder what you're helping us purchase, is we want to strengthen our staffing on communications and outreach, so we can touch base with more and more and more congregations, and through those more and more of you individual you use. So I'm so excited to see all of the geographic diversity in our audience tonight. So let me pull out some of the questions that have been showing up in the chat, and thank Pablo for directing them to me. But let's go back to that graph. First of all, there are two questions. Let me put them together. Why doesn't it feel like the dramatic change that your graphs, well, the World Bank graphs show? And a related question, you talked a lot about the reasons, such as, 1967 was the war on poverty, and the programs that got set up through that were, they've more or less been maintained. But what about the world graph? What were the main reasons for that sharp drop from 1990, I think it was, to 2021 in the poverty drop in the world? Can you share some of the reasons for that?
Well, other people may have, these are good questions. So on the first one, why doesn't it feel? I think, partly it's that we're always focused on what's in front of us, and focused on, news tends to focus on the problems that we face. And one reason I like the graphic so much is that it gives us hope that we miss if you don't take the long view. The other thing is that there are always a lot of bad things happening. The near famine conditions in Somalia and Ethiopia and Yemen and Afghanistan. That's what's in the news now, that there's a world hunger crisis, but not so much that we've seen progress over a period of time. The reasons, I think the most obvious thing, the big reason for progress in the US, you have the war on poverty, and the war on poverty really was a huge triumph. And I think it was because of the race riots, probably, that both parties thought we ought to do something about it. We got to do something about poverty. So there was will, and President Johnson provided the leadership for that, and he had the votes in Congress, and it worked. And then not every program worked, but it broadly worked. And then even when Nixon came to power, it was during the Nixon administration that they started the WIC program and the food stamp program. So it wasn't just a Democrat thing. And then because of the Vietnam War and a kind of stagflation, the kind of thing that we are at risk of right now, that led to kind of a lowering of ambition about the war on poverty. So for a long time, I didn't think any progress had been made much between 74 and now. But just a couple months ago, you might check, New York Times did a really great story. They partnered with a think tank, and they did really impressive review of what's happened to child poverty, I think since between about 1990, I think between 1996, 1995, and 2019. And they, using the Census Bureau's supplemental poverty numbers, which are the best measure, they found that child poverty in the United States has been reduced by half. No, I don't think overall poverty has been, but child poverty seems to have been, and that's because partly because of the tension between the Republicans' emphasis on work. With that emphasis, the two parties together really have focused more on incentives for work, and they've also focused more on what's good for kids. They've shifted programs to things like the child tax credit, and that's worked. And then in the pandemic, I just think that what we've seen is that if government wants to reduce poverty, it can, even in a pandemic. And usually we don't have the political will to do it, but I think the Republicans were so scared by the pandemic shutting down the economy that they were willing to fund, keep the economy open with government funding, and also to do some other things that first year. And then Biden got elected, and Biden spoke to the Poor People's Campaign just before the election. You may remember he gave a really good anti-poverty speech and basically said what he was going to do, and he did it. And much of it in the American Rescue Act. So those are my thoughts.
Thanks, David. Here's a sort of a sensitive question.
Is this about Lutherans?
No, this is about Christian nationalism.
Okay.
How do we counteract the effects of the false prophets of Christian nationalism? How do your organizations try to do that?
Well, I think the problem is broader than than anybody who would, I mean, virtually nobody says I'm a Christian nationalist. There are some now, but I think some of the focus on Christian nationalism actually comes from liberal people who have given it a name that not a lot of the people that they're talking about don't accept that as a name for themselves. But broader than Christian nationalism, what's true is that what I've learned actually since retirement is that many people who go to church and are religious don't experience God as loving. They don't experience that God loves them. They experience God as stern. And those same people, I think some of those same people have kind of believe in a rule-based morality as opposed to a people-based morality. And the statistics show that if you believe that God is stern, you're less likely to support food stamps and foreign aid, because God is tough on you, and you'll help out at the food bank, but you don't want to just give people food stamps. And so I think there's that the religious cohort that is anti-poor people and usually anti-Black. They wouldn't say that, but they are. That is a much bigger cohort than people who would consider themselves Christian white nationalists. So I think what we're fighting against is Trumpism or MAGA Republicanism. But I think Donald Trump brought together really negative forces in the Republican Party and added the venom of his own personality. You know, he is a person who has all his life cheated and lied. He's mean to people he disagrees with. He's mean to vulnerable people. He's an insurgent. If it serves his purpose to overthrow the government, so be it. And so he injected those really nasty personal characteristics into the extreme right in America. And I think he may not run for office again or president again, but it's that bigger, what the Biden administration is calling extreme MAGA Republicanism. That's the enemy. And so I mean, they're the ones we have to fight something much, much bigger than Christian white nationalism. So in terms of fighting Christian white nationalism, I think it is important that in every religious tradition that we have voices of reform within the tradition. The National Association of Evangelicals is doing a really good job, actually. within the evangelical Protestant movement in providing leadership on anti-racism, leadership on poverty, being conservative, but at the same time, loving.
Thanks, David. And I hope people are patient to stay on a little longer. We got a little bit of a late start, so there's a number of more interesting questions. Let's go back. I'm going to combine two questions to poverty rates, world poverty rates. Why do you think poverty is higher in the US than other OECD countries? And related to that, this is one of my favorite questions, having worked in international aid my whole life. Is there an element of neocolonialism in international aid? Is there still? So first, how is the U.S.? Why are we not keeping up with some of the other developed countries?
The main thing is, we tend not to have as strong a sense of social cohesion as the European countries. It's partly we're a huge country and diverse, and people, in Sweden, sort of everybody looks like your cousin. So, so I think in some ways it's, but anyway, for historical reasons or whatever, they do have more of a sense of social cohesion. And so you have stronger social welfare programs. And I remember one OECD study that showed that child poverty was twice as high on average in the US as in the other OECD countries. And the government assistance channel to families with children was half as much. So I think that, and I mean, but that broadly, that's it. We don't use the government, we don't use the government to solve the problem. And not that it can solve the problem by itself, but it can buttress what education and a strong economy can do to give people jobs. And sure, I think within the foreign aid operation, there's a lot of neocolonialism and manipulation, and a lot of aid has multiple motives, and the motive of sometimes it's building schools, but the real motive is buying friends for the United States in a strategically important or something that's a place that's important to us, to our policymakers for national security reasons. So I think people are right to be wary of foreign aid. On the other hand, I think my sense is that when there is a primary clear focus on reducing poverty, on making lives better for the people that you're serving, when there aren't mixed motives, it works. And it works better now than it did when you and I, Charlotte, started when we were working on the Guayaquil Urban Development Project. Partly information technology has made it more transparent what's happening to money all over the world. It's harder to pocket money now than it used to be. And if the bridge doesn't get built, people at the Capitol hear about it in 5 minutes. So I think that the feedback loops are stronger, and it's a better. The whole thing is better quality and less oppressive.
Thanks. Yeah, we could go on for a long time about this, but here's a very specific question about, in your work to reduce hunger, did you address the cruelty in factory farming and processing plants? Now, this isn't only cruelty to animals, but many poor people are actually the workers in those, and immigrants, from my experience, because that's my special interest. They really end up with more injuries and exploitation in general. Did you take any steps to address those issues?
Not much, but it's true. I mean, but we all, we have to make choices about what you focus on. And Bread for the World's a big organization, and we tended to focus on what Congress does best is make financial decisions. So at least my instinct was to focus on the money and try to move money to better things, to good things. And we didn't work on the issue of the terrors of food processing, or we did some on agricultural workers. It's true that the whole food industry, most of the people who work in the food industry, including grocery stores, have tough lives, and maybe their kids don't always eat. So it's a good question. Maybe we should have focused. Maybe during my tenure there, we should have done more on that issue. It's important.
Yeah, and maybe USJS to look into it as well.
Yeah.
I want to save one of the bigger questions, which is something we were discussing earlier today, you and I, but let me see. Reverend Eleanor Pease, one of our former board members, wonders if you could give a couple of examples of how members of Congress have actually been convinced to change because of advocacy, issues that seem so uncontroversial, like reducing child poverty. Why did they even need to have to be convinced? But could you give an example or two of how you feel actually you've changed a vote or two here and there?
Yeah, I mean, over the years, there have been some really dramatic cases, that, that I remember. The debt relief campaign of 99, 2000. When we started, we had no support from anybody in the White House or in Congress, and one of the earliest things that happened was that two women in Birmingham, Alabama, decided to. One of them actually had a kind of road to Damascus experience in her morning prayers and thought she needed to do something about Africa. So these two women started organizing around their member of Congress, a very conservative Republican named Spencer Backus, who's become a good friend. And but they convinced Spencer Backus to become an advocate for debt relief for Africa. It was just, I mean, now that I know that actually some things were happening in his personal and religious life that made him receptive, but it was Pat and Elaine who convinced him to shift. And he went that afternoon and talked to the Secretary of Treasury. And then he came into the what was then called the Banking Committee, and he was a Southern Baptist, but and so he said in the Banking Committee, he said, if we don't do something about the poverty in Africa, they're going to be suffering for a long time, and we're going to be suffering for longer than that. So that's one clear case. Or a lot of with the Bush administration, we had some similar experiences. I think they're just with Bush when he did good things on the Millennium Challenge account, on PEPFAR, on food stamps. Actually, they did really good things, and so the faith community rallied around and helped get those things through Congress, and that worked. I also remember when Bush proposed the Millennium Challenge Corporation. The chair of the Foreign Relations Committee was Senator Biden, and he didn't really. I went to see Senator Biden with several people from Delaware, his constituents, and we asked him to help get it authorized, the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And he said, "Why should we do that?" He said, "Bush is just going to get this thing authorized, and we'll go through all the hoops for that, and then he won't fight for the appropriations. So he'll get credit for getting it authorized, and nothing will happen." But he did it because his constituents came from Delaware. And in fact, what happened then was that between the Democrats and Republicans, it's a better institution because that was done on a bipartisan basis. The Republicans had a good point about efficiency and growth and accountability, and the Democrats pulled it more toward poverty and participation. So that's a third, Eleanor, that's a third example of a specific. Well, let me take one more, which was just wonderful. On the funding, this is a while ago, but on the funding for the Millennium Challenge Corporation, Bush helped to pass the African Growth and Opportunity Act, African Trade Bill, and Bread for the World worked on that. So I was invited to the White House for the signing ceremony. After I had learned how to position myself so that I kind of was spotted. How was he going to get out of the room so that as the president left the room, I'd be able to get close to him. So I did. I managed to talk to the president and said, look, we really need you to focus on getting the money for the Millennium Challenge Corporation. It's just not going to happen unless you need to find a Republican senator who will really be a hero and push. And he said, what are we missing? About $1 billion? And I said, $1.5 billion, sir. I've never said that in my life. But anyway, so he pointed across the room at Senator Lugar, who at that time was prominent on the Foreign Relations Committee. And he sort of took me by the shoulder and pulled me over to Lugar and lobbied for the $1.5 billion we needed for the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and we got it. That's it. I mean, those are very specific situations, but there's just no question in my mind that it happens over and over again. And
faith plays a key role in that. I know Bush was a man really known as a president with
and Backus was a person of faith.
Yeah,
is a person of faith.
And
so
we've been told,
and Biden is that helps.
Biden
actually.
is too. I've certainly been told by staff people and in the conversations we've had with USJ that faith communities are potentially very important, especially if we unite into multi-faith groups and really make the push.
Yep.
Let me ask the big question, and then I'm going to have to, I think, draw to a close.
Yeah, sure.
But so the big question is kind of relates to revolutionary versus incremental change. All right, I'll quote it from the question, Michael Lennon's question. Growing numbers of ecological economists and activists advocate for transformational or revolutionary systemic change, not just incremental improvements. What do you see are the greatest collaborative opportunities between ecological and social justice activists? But what do you if you do have a comment, this is kind of what we were talking about earlier, between the visionary and the feasible.
Well, I think there's room for both. There's room. I mean, both those tendencies have important roles to play. To cast a vision, to a radical vision of what can be done. But then I think you also really need people of faith and vision to push for what you can get done this year or in the next 3 years. In some I guess I think that's where I'm there. I feel like I want to deliver real change for people in need. I want to deliver. So, and I think it seems to me that, but I see that it's important for some people to focus on what could be achieved in, I mean, for the Poor People's Campaign, their change horizon is 50 years. And the changes that are in that graph, those are changes over a couple of generations. So I do think that casting a broad vision is true, that we need to change in big ways, dramatic ways. So that's all true. But then, I also think it's just crucial then to figure out, well, what are very substantial, significant changes that could be affected in the next 2 years or the next 4 years. And so maybe some people do one, some people do the other. And maybe some of us do both, a little both.
Got to have that balance. Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm going to thank Reverend Dr. David Beckmann very much for the time you spent tonight. Maybe if you're willing to hang around a little bit, there's a couple more questions. But for those who need to roll off, perhaps we should deeply thank you. It's been wonderful to hear from you tonight and have the metrics, but hear your vision as well. So
I also really appreciate getting, actually, Charlotte and Pablo gave me an education on Unitarian Universalists, and I learned more about the church and
the faith.
I thought it was a beautiful opening ceremony. So, and I just appreciate. I've come. Actually, my mother and father-in-law were Unitarians. When they moved down to Florida, I don't get this, but they had to choose between two churches, and their two favorite churches were the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Oh my God, that's where I grew up in that church, or the Unitarian Church. But they chose the Unitarian Church, so I do have some Unitarianism in my family. But I learned a lot about UUs just from the briefing I got from Charlotte and Pablo, and also just I really appreciate. I really appreciate. If I can just say one, another thing I learned in my retirement is that people who are not religious tend to be more progressive in general, and more progressive on economic justice issues than people who are religious. This has really changed my thinking. I've just given me more respect and curiosity about the spirituality of people who've chosen not to affiliate with any religion. And but I think the Unitarian churches give, and my guess is that folks in the UUs tend to be sort of like that, but they also have found a way to have fellowship and worship together, and at the same time have the freedom to and the vision to not be captured by dogma and to follow science. So I just see that Unitarianism is a good thing, and I wish you God's blessing.
Thank you, Pastor David. Could we turn to Pastor Kristen to extinguish the chalice, and then we will stay around for a little while to perhaps talk a little bit more and see if there are other questions.
Well, unfortunately, Reverend Kristen had her own version of childcare issues.
Okay.
So she had the crazy 9s instead of the crazy 8s we have in my household. So I will be closing the house unless Reverend Eleanor or Reverend Keithan, would one of you like to do it? Or perhaps Reverend David, would you like to close this in prayer? No? Okay, well then I'll do it. We thank our Spirit of love for gathering us today here in contemplation and learning, to give us the power and the sustenance to move forward in all the good works that we as people striving to live into our best self, the self that sees the humanity in each and every person, and go forward into success. We understand that we have many hearts and minds to change on Capitol Hill and in other legislative bodies throughout the United States, but we also understand that the journey is worthwhile, that the call of sacred love is in fact to learn the lesson that I am you, you are me, and we are one. Amen. Thank you so much. So again, please feel free to roll off and do something else if that's what you are called to do. But Reverend David has just said he'll stick around for a few more minutes to answer some questions, and I will certainly be here. I encourage you to please take that action alert on the child tax credit. I encourage you to join us next week for Vanessa Williamson's talk. I ask you to give to UUSJ. We have lots of things that we can do, but we need your support and your talents to make it happen. And now I don't want to get in the way of those great questions. There are many great questions still in the chat for Charlotte to
Okay, David, have you heard of food healers?
No,
Okay, well, gosh,
I'll look them up.
Rebecca Allen, are you still on? Would you like to brief us on that?
Yes, Food Healers is rather new, but the goal is to feed everybody free, healthy food.
Oh, yeah.
And so we've had a big World Food Healers Day, and we're going to do it at least monthly. And then hopefully we have the founder who's doing it weekly. So we're just saying when we have the money and we can, and groups of us can, we make free food, healthy food available. So that will help the malnourished in the US as well as the poor and the needy.
Great. No, good, good.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Another has, we're a small but mighty denomination, we could say about ourselves, but would you, who've worked with multi-faith groups so frequently, what do you say to us you use? We have a great message, but what's the best way for us to connect with others and engage those who are directly involved in social justice issues?
Well, I think you're doing what I know. You're doing the smart things. I think I see that on the issue of the child tax credit and the big financial bills, you're working with Washington Interfaith Staff Committee, which is a broad coalition of faith groups. I'm working with the sort of slightly more conservative. They're overlapping coalitions, but the Circle of Protection includes the Catholic bishops and the National Association of Evangelicals and some other more conservative leaning groups. And but on the child tax credit right now, WISC and the Circle are working together, and it makes sense to me that you're connected through WISC. I also think the Poor People's Campaign, I really respect what they're doing. It's and so I really appreciate your strong support there. So because you're small but mighty, it makes sense to work in coalition. You're not going to change any law by yourselves. You have to work in probably, you have to work in coalition with other forces, secular and religious. And but then I think it's also smart that this emphasis on making sure the voices of people who are affected, that those voices are heard, as well as the voices of educated Unitarians. I think that just makes all kinds of sense. You come into those coalitions and maybe with a particular passion and skill for what may be the most important thing. So keep it up.
Thank you. I kind of slipped in one of the questions Donna Scheit had asked, but more in her words. So what exactly do you, who have had so much experience in this, what do you see as the role of faith in advocacy?
Well,
is it engaging the grassroots or engaging the federal level congressional offices and executive offices?
Both, and also engaging us.
Mm-hmm.
So faith, it's because of faith that you're all on this call. It's because of your values, because of what you believe, and so faith moves people to push for what's right, and it pushes it. So it moves us, and it moves, and then you have this network of churches and people across the country. So they can, if you appeal to them on the basis of their Unitarian commitments and their faith, the kind of things that they believe in, that moves them to do the right thing. And also with members of Congress, I think they're human beings too. So I certainly speak to members of Congress, not always, but but I make it clear that I'm a pastor, and that the Circle of Protection is a Christian group, and that we're there because we think because we think that God loves everybody, and that love moves us to change the world so that the world is consistent with the fact that God loves everybody. So I try to, without being syrupy or sectarian, just I try to share the faith grounding of what we're doing with members of Congress. And I just think it's just very powerful. I mean, I'm rooted in the Old and New Testaments, and I look at a Nicene Creed guy. So, but that tradition, it's very clear that, and also more broadly, I just think nobody who believes in God thinks that you can be close to God and walk away from somebody who's desperately in need. If you do, you can't, then you're not connected to God. Nobody thinks that. Now, we all do it, but we all know that getting good nutrition to hungry kids, or changing the working conditions for people who are working in food processing plants, that's sacred work. We all know it. It's right. And so I just think it does motivate us. It also helps us to stay in it for the long haul, because these are all long-term processes. And my faith is that in the end, love will out, that history does bend toward justice. And
Yeah, that's the Beckmann version of the arc of the universe bends toward justice.
Yeah,
We have to kind of all reach up and yank it down, I think.
So faith, to me, it's all about faith is very powerful as a motivator and guide too. It's a helpful guide. You look at, maybe you look at like what you've done is you've looked at your principles, basic principles. And so it raises issues of human rights and issues that you might not have otherwise brought into your advocacy on